Well, in continuation of our discussion about, the how to uh, take, take help of other disciplines in reading history correctly, we have seen how science has contributed. Today, one of the major developments which took place is the study of diplomatics. The document, these are related to documents. Yesterday in my lecture, I told you that they were looking at the rigor of language. So that you can know from the by the study of documents. So the study of documents is a very specialized kind of thing. Uh, Diplomatics itself means the study of documents. The term is derived from the Greek word diploma, meaning doubled like this or folded. So it is called diploma. Diplomatics include documents of legal and administrative importance with which it is properly concerned. The study of other records such as bills, reports, cartularies, registers, rolls, they also form part of it. Diplomatics is therefore a basic, not simply an auxiliary, historical science. During Roman antiquity, certain documents containing different sort of authorizations were engraved on a bronze diptych and then folded and sealed in order to keep the content secret when being transported to other places. Hence the term diploma. They were folded. So they were rarely found during Middle Ages. The interest in and description of such documents came to be called Diplomatica Libri 6 by Jean Mabillon. I have talked about Jean Mabillon and this book earlier in my lecture on history and interpretation. So Mabillon's work first made the study of all documents a reputable discipline, a discipline of high repute, because people started believing in his credentials. The forging of documents took place on a vast scale during the earlier Middle Ages. It was realized by church and others, common people, the church and the laity both. You will find during the course of lecture, I will tell you about this in more detail. It was partly because wars and disturbances which frequently upset possession, when the others were dispossessed, and also because the increasing use of written records made it necessary for those, for whose title was, in fact, perfectly good in old, unwritten, customary law to give it a written, substantiation. Thus, forgeries, partly intentionally, honest and partly dishonest, occurred frequently despite the fact that the Germanic tribes who invaded the Greek and Roman Empire that settled in Western Europe inherited with other aspects of Roman law the concept of forgery also as a felony, which was soon also reinforced by the church's canon law. This legal concept of forgery was, however, mainly applied to cases concerning property, even nowadays, mainly done for that, or inheritance, and the literary forgeries such as donation of Constantine, of which I have already spoken about, which purported to be the gift of by the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, who died in 337 AD, so 4th century AD ruler, to Pope Sylvester I of his spiritual primacy throughout the church and of temporal power in Italy. So they were not concerned. Serious critical efforts to detect forgery did not begin in the Middle Ages, although obvious forgeries might be challenged in the course of a dispute. If there is a dispute, somebody might go into that exercise. As early as 6th century, Merovingian king Childebert II declared a charter recording the gift of land from himself to Bishop of Reims, a forgery on the simple ground that the royal official denied the signature to be of his own. He said that no, the official said that this is not my signature. So the exercise begins as early as 6th century. So Pope Innocent III in 1198, 1216 tried to establish some criteria. He thought that he is establishing infallible criteria for the detection of fraudulent papal documents, but knowledge of their earlier documentary forms was totally inadequate. For the contemporary, it was all right, what the principles he laid down, but for earlier versions, it was not possible. There were many, problems of grammar, problems of vocabulary, problems of syntax, and other kinds of problems were there. So in the Renaissance, the humanists, they began to use philosophical and technical criteria. I had in my earlier lecture referred to Petrarch and others who were speaking about the linguistic rigor. One should look into the language of the draft. That should be taken into consideration. Which language, what is the vocabulary which is being used, and what was in current circulation, and what could not have been at one particular period of time. So those kind of things they started looking at. On these grounds, Lorenzo Valla, the famous person, authoritatively pronounced the donation of Constantine to be an act of forgery. I had told you about the terms which are used there. They were not known at the time of the 4th century when Constantine is supposed to have given that document to Sylvester I. But these are so you see, by 15th, 16th century, there is a conscious effort in order to create history. They are now developing modern historical methods in which the dating and other things are very important. So they are also assigning such significance to the documents as well, from which the history is to be constructed. So that forms the part of diplomatics. In the 17th century, we find there are some signal achievements. Why? Because these events in the 17th century forced the development of more sophisticated standards of evaluation of the documents. 30 Years' War in Germany led to endless legal conflicts, and in France, nobility engaged in concerted action known as the Bella Diplomatica, that is, diplomatic wars on the basis of documents, to assert their ancient privileges against royal absolutism. The king was emerging as an absolute monarch. Their power, king was gaining power at the cost of their reduction of power. So they were reduced in power. So they wanted to assert that, look here, you are there are certain rights and certain privileges which were assigned to us, which were with us since ancient times. So in the process, they created some forged documents. The decisive impetus, however, came from a much more particular dispute. Why I am saying this? Because Daniel von Papenbroek, a member of the Jesuit Commission, known as the Bollandists, from another member's name, Jean Bolland, which was charged with the publication of Acta Sanctorum, Acts of Saints, finding that some monastic documents he inspected were forgeries, assumed in 1675 that this was true of almost all early medieval documents on the basis of this examination. So since most of the monasteries with which the documents had been concerned were of De Re Diplomatica, 1681 by Mabillon set out the fundamental principle of science of verifying documents. The document should be verified. And that practice is still continuing. When you go for admission, your documents are verified, whether the principal's signature is there, registrar's signature is there, vice chancellor's signature is there on your documents or not, are the same suppose you have forged, they can detect it. So this practice comes from there. So in other words, the correctness of tenets are very important. Nearly a century later, René Prosper Tassin and Charles Francois, Tostin published their classic six-volume Nouveau Traité diplomatique, 1750 to 65, 10 years, New Treatise on Diplomatica, a work that surpassed Babylon's only in its greater wealth of material. Otherwise, Babylon remains relevant. Another important event in the history of science of diplomatics was the founding of an institution now. Nowadays, you might be hearing about, that there are some institutions which are not functioning properly. So institutions are very important. And by establishing this École des Charles, actually French historians are recognizing, the institutional significance of, checking the documents. So École des Charles, an institute of the training of French archivists, was started in Paris as early as 1821. But the greatest advances were made by German and Austrian scholars, among whom Julius von Ficker investigated the differentiation between actum and datum. These are two very important categories, that is, between verbal legal procedure and its formal documentation. And Theodor von Sickel defined a basic technique of studying and comparing the script of charters, and thus of identifying the individual notaries or scribes. Even now when we go to the bank, they say that put your signature. If it is forged, then they will compare it with the virtual signature which they have on their computers, and you will find that the forgeries can be easily detected. This is the advantage of having computers. Earlier, it was totally on the basis of experience, skill, knowledge of the decipherer, how familiar he was. So, like such developments in France and Germany, historical scholarship in England also have to be taken care of. They also long paid relatively little attention to the legality of the documents like their other counterparts. As opposed to literary records, they were more concerned with the literary records in constructing history. Documents comes later. Although John Michel Campbell published his collection of Anglo-Saxon documents popularly known as Codex Diplomaticus Avi Saxoncini, published in 1839-48, almost 10 years, nearly 10 years. An extensive study of Anglo-Saxon and normal legal and administrative documents was, delayed until the 20th century. By now, diplomatics have evolved as a scientific discipline and is useful for the reconstruction of history, because when we are dealing with history now at this stage of 21st century, we can't ignore the relevance of diplomatics. That's why this lecture was dedicated to diplomatics. Now the question arises, once you are trying to decipher the handwriting, then we will have to know since when we can date that, since when the writing becomes important. I won't make a global survey of this trend, but because that will make a history of languages, I won't do that. We will remain confined to our own country's experience. So, when did we can identify the arrival of writing? There are a lot of debates on this question, but let us see, how it evolved over a period of time. Because you can't do diplomatics, you can't read the epigraphs until unless you know the language of, and you can't know the language until unless they are in written form. Spoken language, well, you can, but oral, there are many other problems with oral versions. So we need writing, and since when writing comes to our knowledge in India. So the present lectures covers the time period which is often thought to be belonging to the phase of recorded history. So we are coming little away from prehistory of the subcontinent. While literary texts continued to be memorized and orally transmitted, the question is whether writing and memorizing now existed side by side. Because for Rigvedic period, we don't have anything in writing. So oral traditions, they continue. And this is not true of India. This is true of all other cultures also. In Arab world and others, wherever writing did not appear before writing, it was oral tradition which was continuing. So the early history of writing in India remains problematic because of many complexities involved in it. We will deal with some of them. Two, the stone inscriptions of the Achaemenid emperors of Iran, from ancient Iran, written in the Old Persian language and in cuneiform script, are dated to the 6th, 5th, and 4th centuries BC. These are valuable texts, no doubt, for the history of the people of northwestern India, because especially in the Gandhari region, which is also part of the geography of the so-called 16 great states. In Sanskrit, this is called Solasa Mahajanpada, from which the modern terminology, the 16 Mahajanpadas, has come. Now, however, debates have not subsided over the question of evidence of writing, especially in pre-Ashokan times. So, the debate will focus around that time. One is familiar with the problems of decipherment of the Harappan or Indus script. In my last lecture, I had told you about the contributions of two scholars. Long gap between its disappearance around 1800 BC, I am talking about Indus script, and the appearance of Ashokan inscriptions after 270 BC, that has given rise to several speculations. How will you explain such a long gap in the history of language writing? Did the art of writing die out? Can we suppose like that? Completely in the second millennium BC by that application of that principle? Or did some form of a yet undiscovered script survive and re-emerge or may re-emerge in historical times sometimes? Was the Vedic culture literate? That will another problem which we have to deal with. So reference to poetic meters, complex arithmetic calculations which are given in of Vedic literature and other classical literature, on the basis of some people antedate our even emergence of human beings in India, have been invoked to contend that cultural phenomena would be impossible without writing. You can't develop a culture like that. These large, huge calculations and other things. But they can be orally transmitted, orally learned also. However, one then needs to explain, it is expected of us, the complete absence of a single explicit and indisputable reference to writing anywhere in Vedic literature. In the entire Vedic literature, you don't find anything referring to writing. Nobody says. The term likhiyate I found in Divya Abdana as late as 1st century AD or something like that. 4th century AD, sorry. 3rd, 4th century AD. Divya Abdan. There is a reference to likhiyate term. So what about Vedic literature? We don't have any reference. And if someone has, then they should let us know. Amongst the Greek authors who had come to India with Alexander or shortly after his invasion of northwestern India in the last quarter of the 4th century BC, what was their perception of Indian scenario? Because they are coming, they are writing, so they are familiar with writing, they have learned the alphabets much earlier, so at least they knew how to write, and they had many written documents, already they had already had a constitution called Draco Constitution as early as, 6th century BC or something like that. So when they are coming, what was their perception? Let us take first Nearchus, 325 BC around. He mentions that Indians wrote letters on cotton cloth. Now this is a very significant statement, that they wrote on cotton cloth. 325 BC is the time of Nearchus. But Megasthenes, the famous Greek ambassador in the court of Chandragupta Maurya, his period is same, 322 to 298 BC, strongly affirmed that Indians, I quote, did not know written characters. That is why that was one of the criterions why they called the Indians barbarians. Not because we are brutal, but because we did not have a constitution, we did not know about writing, the art of writing. Since Nearchus visited only northwestern India, he may have seen evidence of either Kharoshthi or perhaps Aramaic. Both these scripts are seen in Ashokan inscriptions from that area, Manshera and Shahbazgadi area. On the other hand, Megasthenes' observation, made most probably in the context of legal procedures which he saw in eastern India, could perhaps not be taken to imply a total absence of writing. The classical accounts, therefore, do not help us in resolving the puzzle about arrival of writing. Though some canonical texts in Pali do make allusions to private and official correspondence by means of letters, their definite ascription to pre-Mauryan times is somewhat suspect. Why? The quite central to our understanding of the antiquity of writing in the Indian context is the absolutely unambiguous reference to lipi or libi in Panini. That is, a script in Panini's great work on grammar, Ashtadhyaya. Since the chronology of Panini is also wrapped up in controversy, there are controversies about his, which period he belonged to, it would help us to keep in mind an authoritative recent opinion of George Cardona. He has worked on this, that the evidence available hardly allows one to date Panini later than early mid-4th century BC. Mid-4th century BC. So this has to be taken due credence, because this Cardona has worked on both, the structure, the grammar, the internal evidence of Ashtadhyaya, and then he comes to the conclusion. It's a massive work, one should read it. While this would certainly push back the antiquity of writing to the pre-Mauryan times, at least mid-4th century BC, the question of the identity of the script, how it was written, what form it had, mentioned by Panini still remains unresolved. Which script he is talking about? So it is generally recognized that the great grammarian Panini belonged to the northwestern India, and therefore may have been familiar with the Aramaic script, because that was prevalent. The Ashokan inscription is a big testimony of that, in use in the Achaemenid Empire. This would leave the question of the origins of Indian scripts, especially Brahmi, and the prevalence of writing in the Ganga plains is still largely open. What about the archaeological and epigraphic evidence at hand? Let us examine them. What do we find there? Scholars have referred to several inscriptions which are clearly written in Brahmi script and in a non-Sanskrit language, Magadhi form of Prakrit. The Piprahava Vas inscription, recording the deposit of bodily relics, probably of the Buddha and of Mahasthan stone plaque and Soghara, bronze plaque inscriptions, all these three contain instructions for the storage of surplus grain and other products as a precaution against famine, which apparently was a regular phenomenon at that time because, have sometimes been regarded as a pre-Mauryan, making them the oldest inscriptions of India. Well, fine. Legitimate doubts have been raised against such early dating. I am deliberately saying that legitimate, suspicion. Why? Because claims of some other Brahmi inscriptions, such as those from Dyotak and Barli, being pre-Mauryan texts, have been set aside by more cautious scholars recently on the grounds of their paleography. That's why there comes paleography's significance, which we have already dealt in detail in my previous lecture. So, on the basis of paleographical science or knowledge, they have already been rejected, you can say. So, now they are being more advanced than that of the inscriptions of Ashoka. The alleged specimens of Kharoshthi and Brahmi letters on coins of Achaemenid emperors of Iran dating from the 5th, 4th centuries BC are also equally doubtful. They have to be examined. The case for the pre-Mauryan origins of Brahmi script has been reinvigorated in recent years from an unexpected quarter. It has been generally assumed that many things, including the Brahmi script, came to Sri Lanka with Buddhism from India during Ashoka's time. This was the hypothesis. Recent excavations at Anuradhapura have come up with a much earlier date, 5th, 4th century BC, for a graffiti in Brahmi on potsherds. Recently, there have also been claims of Brahmi characters having been found incised on a potsherd of a pre-Mauryan date recovered from Mangulam. It's a place in Tamil Nadu where they, So, the unmistakable message of the Anuradhapura evidence is that Sri Lanka, at least a primitive form of Brahmi, did indeed predate the Mauryan period. Subrayalu Sahab and others, they all, have raised this question that which Brahmi should be considered earlier. Now, there is a general consensus that possibly the Anuradhapura was not in such a developed form as we find in the case of Tamil Nadu script. This raises the question about Kharoshthi as well. Did Panini's reference to Lipi or Libi imply Kharoshthi? Is he referring to Kharoshthi script? Apparently, an affirmative answer to these questions cannot be absolutely ruled out. It appears like more likely that he is referring to Kharoshthi script, possibly. In fact, given the complexities of political organizations, the cultural metrics reached by the pre-Mauryan times, it has been argued, it has been contended that the existence of writing would have been necessary. Otherwise, how could they have such an elaborate statecraft and society, a vast society? The cautious statements such as that of A.B. Keith, who was writing as early as 1922, draws our attention again. According to Keith, the real development of writing belongs in all likelihood to the 5th century BC. He was of that opinion. And they are not totally unreasonable also on the basis of our present level of knowledge about writing, about Lipi. This point of view put forward in 1922 has recently been reasserted by no less a person than K.R. Norman and a few other scholars. They also agree with him. They endorse his views that it could be of 5th century, 5th, 4th century BC when Indians knew about writing. But on the other hand, there is complete absence of any trace of Brahmi writing from any definitely pre-Mauryan strata at any site which have been discovered so far, excavated so far in northern India, that still poses a very serious objection to such suggestions as has been given by A.B. Keith and K.R. Norman. So, the earliest inscriptional evidence makes it clear that language represented by earliest writing was not Sanskrit. The short inscriptions on potsherds found at Anuradhapura are evidently proper names of the next, which I will show on the next in the slide. Even the language of most of the dubiously pre-Mauryan epigraphs, such as that of Piprava or Mahasthan inscriptions, conforms to varieties of Magadhi Prakrit. This is this you can't read, but you can find this Prakrit is Brahmi is there. So it is just this tells us that it was a kind of say writing which was evolving, it was taking shape, and this is from the 4th century BC levels at Anuradhapura. The earliest complete inscription in grammatically correct Sanskrit, almost 450 years later it has come, that is from AD 150. You all know about that. When the Shaka ruler, the king, Rudradaman, got his poetic panegyric engraved on the same rock surface of Girnar in Junagadh, Gujarat, that carries the rock edict of Ashoka and Maurya also, Ashoka. Some scholars have argued that a short two-line inscription of Dhana Deva, in the inscription Dhana is mentioned, we put in bracket, you will see we have put this Deva because that was the name actually that we should assume because that place is blank. From Ayodhya is the earliest Sanskrit inscription, and that has been dated to the 1st century AD. So it antedates the 150 Rudradaman inscription. That is possibly our first Sanskrit inscription. However, scholars like D.C. Sarkar, the well-known noted epigraphist of our country, found that his language is not classical Sanskrit. And he very logically says that it was Sanskrit influenced by Prakrit, meaning thereby that Prakrit is preceding and it is influencing the succeeding language. Significantly, the earliest inscriptions in Tamil too antedate those of Sanskrit. These inscriptions are found in Tamil Nadu and have been dated to the period from the late 3rd century BC to the 1st century AD. It deserves to be highlighted that these small texts are not royal proclamations. They are not royal proclamations, as when I was discussing, dealing with diplomatics in the earlier part, but they relate to the life of the ordinary people. So they contain personal and occupational names, professional names of them, of donors who endowed, who gifted, mainly for the benefit of Jaina monks, facilities of stone beds in natural caverns. Jogimara Hill has a very elaborate caverns like that. They also show that donors were often merchants and traded in gold, cloth, plowshare, very interesting, plowshare made of iron, and salt, toddy, etc. Here, next I will take up in my next lecture, we will be discussing reconstruction of languages. Right, thank you very much.